if any of you have studied economics, you know that that's the right conclusion. It's the same conclusion that's given to the South, the Third World today. Well, having gained their independence, the colonies were free to ignore his advice, to ignore what's called sound economic theory, and to follow England's own course of independent state-guided development, which radically rejected sound economic theory in ways that ought to be understood here. For example, England was stealing high technology from the Low Countries and from Ireland and using state force to create a powerful economy. So the U.S. followed the same course. It set up high tariffs to block British exports, first textiles, later steel, initiated all sorts of other devices to accelerate industrial development. And the now independent republic also attempted to gain a monopoly of cotton. Came pretty close. The reasons were stated explicitly. The reasons were to place all other nations at our feet, particularly the British enemy, which was militarily more powerful in those days, but could be brought to the feet of the United States if the U.S. monopolized the cotton, which is crucial for their early industrial development. Those were the Jacksonian presidents, their announcement when they conquered Texas and half of Mexico. But notice that the U.S. policies in the mid-19th century were essentially those that were attributed to Saddam Hussein. There were wild claims that he was trying to control the energy resources of the Middle East and bring the rest of the world to his feet. Well, that was a fantasy, but it wasn't a fantasy when the U.S. carried out those policies in the mid-19th century. It's one of the ways it became the most powerful, richest country in history. Well, for Egypt, there wasn't any comparable course because it was barred by British power. Lord Palmerston declared that no ideas of fairness toward Egypt ought to stand in the way of such great and paramount interests of Britain as preserving its economic and political hegemony. He expressed what he called his hate for the ignorant barbarian Muhammad Ali, kind of developmental leader of Egypt who dared to seek an independent course. He deployed Britain's fleet, major military force of the 19th century, and British financial power, which is also overwhelming, to terminate Egypt's quest for independence and economic development. And so it continued. After World War II, when the United States displaced Britain as global hegemon, Washington adopted the same stand. Washington made it clear to the Egyptians that it would provide no aid unless Egypt adhered to the standard rules, the rules for the weak, that is. Meanwhile, the U.S. continued to violate them, for example, by imposing high tariffs on to bar Egyptian cotton. That's the usual interpretation of market principles. They're fine for the weak, but not for the strong, at home as well. That's why maybe a quarter of the U.S. population is now qualifying for food stamps, while the bankers are providing themselves with enormous bonuses. Those are market principles. In Adam Smith's defense, I should say that he recognized what would happen if Britain followed the rules of sound economics. And now it's called neoliberalism. It's not very different. He warned that if British manufacturers, merchants, and investors turned abroad, they might profit, but England would suffer. But he felt that that wouldn't happen because they would be guided by what's called a home bias. So as if by an invisible hand, England would be spared the ravages of economic rationality. Actually, that passage in Wealth of Nations is pretty hard to miss. It's the only time that the phrase invisible hand appears in the book, namely in an argument against what we now call neoliberalism. That's the one occurrence of the famous phrase. The other leading founder of classical economics, David Ricardo, he drew similar conclusions. He hoped that the home bias, quote him now, would lead men of property to be satisfied with the low rate of profits in their own country rather than to seek a more advantageous employment for their wealth in foreign nations. Feelings, he said, that I would be sorry to see weakened. Put aside their predictions, but the instincts of the classical economists were sound and significant and conformed to economic history. The democracy uprising in the Arab world is sometimes compared to Eastern Europe in 1989, but on very dubious grounds. In 1989, the democracy uprising was tolerated by the Russians, and of course it was supported by Western power in accord with the standard doctrine that democracy is okay if it conforms to strategic and economic objectives. So it's fine in Eastern Europe where it's breaking up the global enemy, but not in Central America at the same time, where it's being crushed by violence. There's no Gorbachev in the West today. On the contrary, Western power remains very hostile to democracy in the Arab world for quite good reasons, as I mentioned. There are actually more apt comparisons between what's happening today and developments in the past, but I could talk about them later if you like, but I'll put them aside now for reasons of time. Well, coming to the present, grand area doctrines, pretty much in the way they were expressed back in the Second World War, they continue to apply to contemporary crises and confrontations. So take what's called in Western policy-making circles and in political commentary, it's taken for granted that the major threat to world order today is what's called the Iranian threat. In fact, this is called the Year of Iran, and therefore it has to be the major focus of U.S. foreign policy, with Europe trailing along politely, as it tends to do. So we might ask ourselves exactly what is the Iranian threat. In fact, you might look and see how often it's discussed. I mean, it's also always brought up, but exactly what is it? What's the Iranian threat? Well, we actually have an authoritative answer to that question. It was provided by the Pentagon and by U.S. intelligence services. Every year they give an annual report to Congress on global security. The most recent one, a couple of months ago, they, of course, had a section on the Iranian threat. And what they say is that the Iranian threat is not military. Quote, I'll quote, Iran's military spending is relatively low compared to the rest of the region. Its military doctrine is strictly defensive, designed to slow an invasion and force an invasion of Iran, and to force a diplomatic solution to hostilities. Iran has only a limited capability to project force beyond its borders. Its military spending is a fraction of Saudi Arabia, of course, incomparably less than the United States or its allies. And according to General Petraeus, the head of the U.S. Central Command, the Iranian Air Force could be taken out almost instantly by the Air Force of Qatar. Forget the rest. So that's the military threat. With regard to